Dr. Anthony Harper here, blessed to be with Yorum Ettinger of the Ettinger Report, by the way. And then also, Yorum, you are the previous ambassador to.
Well, I was an ambassador in the Israeli embassy in Washington, in charge of Israel's relations with the U.S. Congress. And before that, I was Israel's consul general to the southwestern states based in Houston, Texas. And since my retirement back in 1993, I have visited the US five times a year, always about a week on Capitol Hill, briefing US legislators and their staffers, and speaking in different communities throughout the US with a focus on what I would call flyover America or small town America rather than the major cities of America.
Well, you have a lot of valuable experience regarding Middle East issues. And I know that you have some very important comments to make about President Jimmy Carter, who recently passed away. And I would like for you to share with our audience about Jimmy Carter, about the policies that he had and the implications in the Middle East. What would you like to say most importantly about his Middle East policies?
Certainly. When it comes to the late President Jimmy Carter, there's no doubt that he deserves some, and I emphasize some credit for the Egyptian-Israeli peace accord. I would not refer to him as the engineer of the peace treaty or a person who was mostly responsible for the peace treaty. And the reason is that if you scrutinize the late President Carter's policies in the Middle East, then I believe the conclusion is that that should be studied as an exercise in avoiding very critical mistakes by U.S. policy in the Middle East, which did do much harm to American interest and Middle East stability. And the first thing that comes to my mind is not the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, but rather the rise of the Ayatollah's regime in Iran. President Carter was mostly responsible for facilitating the rise of the Ayatollahs to the helm in Iran by stabbing the back of the Shah of Iran, who was America's most important ally at that time, back in 1978, 79, America's policeman in the Gulf. And he facilitated the rise of the Ayatollahs to the helm in Tehran by adhering to State Department and CIA assessments and reports, which described Ayatollah Khomeini at that time, back in 78, in exile in Paris, as potentially an Iranian edition of Mahatma Gandhi, basically moderate leader. And President Carter, when he addressed a gathering of global leaders in the islands of Guadeloupe, 10 days before the return of Ayatollah Khomeini from exile in Paris to Tehran and toppling the regime of the Shah of Iran, President Carter addressed global leaders saying that they should be rest assured that Ayatollah Khomeini is going to be preoccupied with tractors, not with tanks, and that he certainly, so said President Carter, as he heard from his ambassador to Tehran, at that time Ambassador William Sullivan, that Ayatollah Khomeini had no interest in exporting the Islamic Revolution beyond the area of Iran, and moreover, being a devout Muslim, Ayatollah Khomeini was anti-communist and therefore anti-Soviet and therefore very amenable to US policy. The aim of Ayatollah Khomeini, who flooded President Carter and the State Department and the CIA, especially the US Embassy in Tehran, they were flooded with very moderate, peaceful statements made by Ayatollah Khomeini, which was an exercise in dissimulation, which trapped the US foreign policy establishment. The aim of Ayatollah Khomeini was to use US influence in Tehran by curbing, constraining the Iranian military, which was very well aware of the radical fanatic ideology driving Ayatollah Khomeini, and they were determined to prevent his takeover of control in Iran. But it was President Carter, under the delusion that Ayatollah Khomeini was going to be moderate, and he therefore ordered the Iranian military, which was fully dependent on the US, to refrain from obstructing Ayatollah Khomeini's rise to power. And as expected, very few days after his takeover control of Iran, he started executing leaders of the Iranian military. And later on, again, as expected, he took over control of the American embassy in Tehran, held some 50 Americans hostage for about 444 days, and once again demonstrating that terrorists always bite the hand that feeds them. Naive Western policymakers assume that financial gesture, diplomatic gesture extended to terrorists have the power to induce moderation. And always, but always, it only whets the appetite of terrorists, who then bite the Western hand that feeds them. And the policy of the late President Jimmy Carter literally paved the road for Iran to be transformed from America's top ally in the very critical Middle East to America's #1 epicenter of anti-American terrorism, anti-American drug trafficking and money laundering, and anti-American proliferation of advanced military systems. And the results of that very, very self-destructive policy from the American point of view, the results are still with us until this very day, because most of the volcanic eruptions in the Middle East, also in Eastern, Northern, Western Africa, and increasingly in other parts of the world, also in Latin America, where we have more and more eruption of anti-American sentiments, much of it has been connected to what I would call the head of the venomous octopus in Tehran, which has been determined to bring the so-called great American Satan to submission, and much of it complement of the late President Carter's policies.
Well, I know that I've heard in the U.S. before that President Carter then referred to the Ayatollah as a holy man. So the question is, how could President Carter be so deceived by the intentions of the Ayatollah? And you mentioned that he lied a lot. He said a lot of good things to really to get back into power?
Well, there is an old, some 1400-year-old Islamic tactic. It's called taqiyya. And taqiyya allows and sometimes order devout Muslims to use dissimulation in order to mislead enemies and eventually bring them to submission. And Ayatollah Khomeini used that tactic very, very well. How come President Carter was so easily trapped by that soft tongue approach by Ayatollah Khomeini? In my mind, the reason was President Carter or President Carter embracing the State Department state of mind, especially being influenced by his national security advisor Brzezinski and the State Department establishment, as well as national security advisor Brzezinski, basically were frustrated by Middle East reality, which hasn't experienced intra-Muslim or intra-Arab peaceful coexistence for the last 1400 years. But here you have State Department officials and National Security Advisor Brzezinski eager, and due to legitimate concerns, eager to bring about peace, to resolve conflicts, and introduce into the Middle East Western values such as peaceful coexistence, human rights, democracy, etc. And in order to facilitate that, they decided to follow their own alternate reality at the expense of the Middle East real reality. And the alternate reality is very convenient. Alternate reality provides easy ways to bring about peace. The problem is that those ways are unrealistic, which brings me now to the late president and his approach to the Arab-Israeli peace. Under the influence of the State Department and National Security Advisor Brzezinski, President Carter was determined to bring an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. He genuinely wanted to bring an end to that. But again, under the influence of the State Department and through this alternate reality, he decided that irrespective of Middle East reality, it's the Palestinian issue, which is the core cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict, a major reason for the turbulence in the Middle East, and a crown jewel of Arab policymakers, none of which has anything to do with Middle East reality, and therefore he contacted the Prime Minister of Israel at that time, the late Begin, and the President of Egypt, the late Sadat, and invited them to come to an international conference to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he indicated that at the table will be also the Soviet Union and Syria and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was a major Palestinian terror organization. And obviously, the Israeli Prime Minister opposed such a setup, which would give veto power to the Soviets, to Syria, to Palestinian terrorists. But he was joined by President Sadat, because President Sadat was very experienced with Palestinian treacherous attitude when it comes to intra-Arab relations. Back in the 1950s, the Palestinians were allowed to terrorize Israel from Egypt, but within a year or 2 years, they joined forces with Muslim Brotherhood terrorists inside Egypt, terrorizing their own host. They did the same thing in Syria during the 1960s, the same thing in Jordan in 1970, and for about 12 years, 1970 through 1982, They terrorized, agitated Lebanon. And in 1990, the Palestinians in Kuwait joined Saddam Hussein's invasion to Kuwait. And once again, they stabbed the back of their host, that time Kuwait. And President Sadat was determined to prevent an international conference which contradicted his own Egyptian interest. He did not want to allow radical elements such as the USSR in Syria and the PLO to dictate Egyptian interest, and therefore it was President Carter's insistence on international conference which drove President Sadat, Prime Minister Begin, to dialogue directly with each other. They were assisted by the King of Morocco at that time, by the leaders of Romania. And once President Carter realized that Egypt and Israel were very close to achieving peace accord, he then also agreed to become deeply involved in a direct dialogue rather than international conference. And that's where he certainly deserves some credit, because he was very instrumental in finalizing the agreement. He did not initiate it. He did not play the key role, but he certainly deserves much credit for allowing it to be finalized. And the key reason was the Egyptian interest in getting closer and closer to the USA. President Sadat realized that the future of Egypt was much, much more promising in association with the US than with the USSR. That's the reason he rejected Soviet involvement in the peace process. And that's where President Carter played a role. And by the way, during those final days of finalizing the accord, President Carter tried again to bring in the Palestinian issue to the center stage. And Prime Minister Begin told him literally, you do that and you're going to send me back home to Jerusalem, abruptly ending the peace process here. And President Carter backed off. He then tried to bring in Syria as well, suggesting to Prime Minister Begin to agree to give a so-called hint that in the future, Israel will consider getting off the Golan Heights. And once again, Prime Minister Begin indicated that if the President Carter insists on Israel accepting a withdrawal from the Golan in the future, then that would be the end of any peace process between Israel and Egypt. And the interesting thing was that President Sadat did not join President Carter's insistence on a Palestinian state or on Israeli withdrawal from the Golan. Obviously, President Sadat made some statements, but that was a talk. He did not walk the way President Carter wanted him to walk. The bottom line is that today, when we look at Iran, the way to deal with Iran should be 180 opposing President Carter's way, namely not to appease the Ayatollahs, not to address them diplomatically, but to realize that it is regime change in Iran which would end the impact of the venomous octopus from Tehran, and likewise in the peace process. Israel today has 6 peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, South Sudan. None of them is focused on the Palestinian issue. In fact, it's because the Palestinian issue was not at the center of any such agreement that we arrived at those agreements. And I think the lesson from President Carter's policy is that to pursue further peace accords between Israel and additional Arab and Muslim countries, we have to focus on Arab and Muslim countries' interests rather than Palestinian state idea. We have to focus on Saudi interests to bring about Israel-Saudi peace accords. We have to focus on Kuwaiti interests, on Omani interests, or Indonesian interests. But to assume that the Arabs regard the Palestinian issue as a prerequisite means detachment from the Middle East. And last comment, President Carter, just like the State Department, was very, very much impressed with moderate Arab talk. Among those statements coming out of Arab capitals was their devotion to the Palestinian issue. However, while the Arab talk towards the Palestinians has always been very embracing, the Arab walk on the Palestinian issue has been anywhere from indifference to antagonistic, because the Arabs are very much aware of the Palestinian walk among Arabs, which has been replete with subversion and terrorism and treachery, and therefore none of the Arab-Israeli peace treaties until today was based, centered on the Palestinian issue.
I have to ask, do we have any evidence that there were plants within the State Department that were Islamists, that were Muslims in the State Department influencing this decision to allow for and to deceive President Carter to accept the Ayatollah back into power?
Well, I'm not aware in any what I would call anti-Semitic or philo-Islamic sentiments, maybe, but I'm not aware of it. But certainly, the state of mind then and now in the State Department is a state of mind which is divorced from Middle East reality and enmeshed in alternate reality. The State Department policy towards the Middle East, in a way, has been pretty simplistic in assuming that the Arab talk reflects the Arab walk on the Palestinian issue, and therefore they have concluded in the State Department, they did conclude during President Carter's days, as they do now, that Arab talk towards the Palestinians indicate that Arabs are centered on or determined to bring about a Palestinian state. The reality is that since the War of Independence of 1948-49, which basically established the modern-day Jewish state, since that time until today, no Arab country did adapt a philo-Palestinian walk. They always have expressed themselves in a very embracing way towards the Palestinians, but never translating it into action. That somehow has escaped the attention of the State Department, and I would add, at the expense of American interests, because when you provide assistance, for instance, to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is today's Palestinian Authority, when you pressure Israel to slow down on fighting Palestinian terrorism in Gaza, you in fact inadvertently, unintentionally provide tailwind to Islamic terrorism in the Middle East, which works against American interest, bearing in mind that the Middle East is the chief epicenter of anti-American Islamic terrorism, when you provide assistance to Muslim Brotherhood terrorists in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East, when you provide assistance to Muslim Brotherhood political and religious branches in the US itself, you literally provide tailwind to arch enemies of every pro-American Arab government. As far as the Saudis and the Emiratis and Egypt and Jordan are concerned, they are facing two major lethal threats. One of them, obviously, Iran's Ayatollahs, and then there is the Muslim Brotherhood. Obviously, you should add also ISIS. But Muslim Brotherhood terrorists are considered by every single pro-American Arab regime as a lethal threat. And the State Department has been consistent in approaching the Muslim Brotherhood as a religious element, political, educational, social welfare, ignoring the fundamental vision of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is to topple every single pro-American Muslim regime and bring the American infidel to submission.
I have to ask about, what do you expect President Trump is going to be able to clean up this problem at the State Department? How can he get the State Department to get on the page of reality here?
Well, if we rely, and that's one way of doing it, relying on track record, the track record of President Trump during his first administration indicates that he was the only American president who literally evicted the State Department from center stage of shaping and navigating U.S. foreign policy. That's the way that the Abraham Accords were achieved. If President Trump would have followed the State Department policy, we wouldn't have the 4 peace accords between Israel and Arab countries. My assumption is that during this coming administration, President Trump once again is going to put the State Department away from center stage of shaping and navigating U.S. foreign policy. And in my mind, that bodes well to the U.S. in general and to the peace process in particular.
Well, he could fire a lot of people at the State Department that are in opposition to the reality of the issue. But I have to mention that, and you may have heard that many evangelical Christians are very leery about the Abraham Accords, being that this is being some proposed peace attempt to bring peace to the Middle East, but that it may be a false peace. Any comment about this being a false peace plan?
I wouldn't call it false peace, but again, we have to be aware of the nature of our neighborhood here in the Middle East. In the Middle East, where there hasn't been any Arab democratic regime going back to the 7th century until today, regimes are basically tenuous. They don't rise to power through the ballot. They rise to power through the bullet, namely some sort of violence. And one day they will lose power, not through the ballot, but through bullet or violence. And that means that we're talking about tenuous regimes. Tenuous regimes yield tenuous policies, and tenuous policies yield tenuous accords. And therefore, we have to be realistic and approach any peace accord as a peace accord in a very tenuous context, which means Israel must not consider peace accords with Arabs as a central piece in Israel's own national security. It's very important to have more and more peace accords between Israel and Arab countries, but we must not consider such peace accords as a centerpiece of national security. And to be specific, Israel's number one component of national security are the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank. Those mountain ridges are not only the cradle of Jewish religion, Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish language, but they also happen to be the most important asset or component of our posture of deterrence of our national security. Without control of those mountain ridges, we are not going to have the capability to withstand a surprise blitz or surprise Arab offensive against Israel. And there have been some suggestions coming out of, the State Department that Israel should exchange control of the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria with peace treaty, let's say, with Saudi Arabia. This would be a very, very self-destructive mistake, reckless mistake by Israel or by the U.S. proposing such a policy, because with all due respect to peace with Saudi Arabia or peace with Egypt, this is peace accord with a certain regime. The regime in Egypt shifted back in 2011 from the regime of today to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was on the verge of doing away with peace accord with Israel. Thank God we had returned to the helm by the current regime in Egypt to exchange a tenuous asset with a fixed asset, namely the mountains of Judea and Samaria, would be unrealistic, would be very, very delusional, would be reckless and self-destructive for Israel and for the U.S. And last comment, should we adhere to the State Department and allow a Palestinian state on the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria, that would mean a death sentence to the pro-US Hashemite regime in Jordan. Toppling the Hashemite regime in Jordan would transform pro-US Jordan into anti-US paradise for Islamic terrorist organizations within the area of Jordan, which is not going to be limited to havoc inside Jordan, but it would produce ripple effects southward into Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, namely threatening the survival of every single pro-American oil-producing Arab regime in the Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf area. That would be a bonanza for the Ayatollahs of Iran, bonanza for China and Russia, would create havoc to Western economy, would create instability as far as the price of oil, and all that as a result of a Palestinian state in the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria. Israeli control of those mountain ridges does mitigate the wrath of instability in the Middle East, because Israel on the mountains, on the mountain ridges of Judea, Samaria, minimizes the prospect of terrorism and wars, and in fact serves as a major line of defense for the pro-Hashemite regime in Jordan.
Well, there's a lot to really address, to uncover in this matter, and people can learn more information about these issues. You have a website. You have, as I mentioned, you're with the Ettinger Report. What is a website that people can learn more?
Well, I would welcome visits to www. The Ettinger Report, Ettinger with the double T, and I can also be addressed directly via my email, which is Yoram Tex, like Texas, Yoram Tex at gmail.com, and I would welcome not only any query, but especially any disagreement, any opinion contradicting whatever I've said, and that would produce a very constructive dialogue.
Oh, but finally, would you say that you're in agreement with Ambassador nominee Mike Huckabee on the reasons for opposing a Palestinian state?
Well, absolutely, because just like hopefully the new American ambassador to Israel, Governor Mike Huckabee, I fully concur with him that all we need to do is adhere to historical facts. Historical facts are that the mountain ridges of Judea, Samaria are the cradle of what makes the Jewish state a Jewish state, namely Jewish history, Jewish religion, Jewish culture, Jewish language. And how can anyone expect any nation to give up its cradle of history and religion and culture in return for any agreement, even peace agreement? And I think Governor Huckabee also is in agreement with anyone who realizes that a Palestinian state on the mountain ridges of Judea, Samaria, would undermine vital American interests and would threaten America's pro-American Arab regimes in the Middle East.
Well, let's get a little bit of history. I know that President Trump joined Jared Kushner about a peace plan that would be dividing Israel. A map came out on January 28, 2020, that showed the division of Israel with a Palestinian state in the heartland of Israel, that Judea Samaria issue. Have you heard any comments about President Trump saying that that was a mistake to promote that kind of a map?
Well, I haven't heard yet, but I hope that just like any other person, President Trump is going to learn from the past by avoiding rather than by repeating critical mistakes. Obviously, one such mistake was presenting a peace accord with a Palestinian state. And the other mistake, I believe, was President Trump's policy towards Iran, whereby he attempted to reach another and a better agreement with Iran. The Ayatollahs of Iran are not partners for negotiation. The Ayatollahs of Iran are target for regime change. During the first administration, President Trump, to his credit, imposed very top pressure, maximum pressure, crippling economic sanctions, which indeed crippled the Iranian economy, constrained its ability to help terror organizations and entities throughout the world. However, as we know from reality, those crippling maximum pressure economic sanctions were and are reversible. We were aware of it when President Biden took over back in January of 2021, and the first thing he did, he suspended President Trump's economic sanctions, which proved their reversibility. Should President Trump once again impose economic sanctions on the Ayatollahs rather than attempting to bring about a regime change, once again, he's going to approach the Ayatollahs in Iran with reversible steps. Regime change is irreversible, and irreversibility is a critical element, should be a critical element in US or free world policy towards Iran. The aim should not be to minimize the volcanic nature of the regime in Iran. The aim should not be to delay the volcanic eruptions out of Iran. The aim should be to produce irreversible regime change. And I hope and I trust that President Trump and his advisors, his hopefully coming Secretary of State, Senator Mark Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, Special Advisor on Countering Terrorism, Sebastian Gorka, and other such top people, all of them have realized, will realize that the way to deal with the Ayatollahs is not to consider them partners to negotiation, but target for regime change for the sake of America's interest, for the sake of Middle East stability, and for the sake of the free world.
I understand. Once again, your website is
www.theettingerreport.com, and my email address is yoramtex@gmail.com.
Thank you, Yoram, for joining us and sharing with our audience about these really crucial issues that are impacting the Middle East.
And thank you very much for your tenacious dedication to shed light on Middle East reality and expose wishful thinking and misrepresentation. Thank you very much.